Improve Your Thinking. Episode 4. Lessons from Logic.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Improve Your Thinking. I'm your host Kevin Brown, and today I want to talk a little about logic and how you can use it. Logic is usually defined as the science of evaluating arguments. Logic gives us a set of tools for determining whether arguments are well reasoned and if the premises provide support for the conclusion. Logic can also help us identify flaws in our reasoning. But some of the lessons logic teaches are a little bit counterintuitive. So let me begin by addressing 5 of these counterintuitive lessons that logic teaches us. Number 1, an argument with true statements can be invalid. An argument is said to be valid if the premises provide necessary support for the conclusion. An argument can do this with either true or false statements depending on how they are formulated. However, just because the premises of an argument are true does not mean the argument is valid. While the argument may sound persuasive, it could be the case that the premises do not provide support for the conclusion. A good example of this is the following argument, which contains all true statements but is nevertheless invalid. Premise: all banks are financial institutions. Premise: Chase is a financial institution. Conclusion: therefore Chase is a bank. This argument contains all true statements, and it seems valid, it seems persuasive, but in reality, the premises don't provide necessary support for the conclusion. It's possible that the premises are true, and yet the conclusion be false. Just because the premises are true in this case, just because all banks are financial institutions and Chase is a financial institution, it doesn't necessarily follow that Chase is a bank. So this argument is invalid. A second counterintuitive lesson that logic teaches us: statements can sound very different, yet mean exactly the same thing. One of the insights you can learn from categorical logic is that statements which sound entirely different are in fact equivalent in meaning. One of the purposes of studying categorical logic is to learn precisely this insight. Another purpose is to give you the power to simplify complex statements such as this one. Some employees who are not currently on the payroll are not ineligible for workers' benefits. Categorical logic can show that this rather unclear statement is really the same as this much simpler statement. Some of those eligible for workers' benefits are not currently on the payroll. A third counterintuitive lesson that logic teaches: there's mathematical-like rigor to ordinary language. Certain words in ordinary language, such as and, or, if-then, and if and only if, function somewhat like the mathematical operators for addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. What this means is that you can determine whether statements are true or false without knowing everything about the statement's content. For example, in the statement, "Nixon resigned the presidency and Clinton wrote the Gettysburg Address," you can determine that this statement is false if all you know is that Clinton did not write the Gettysburg Address. Partial information can lead you to detect when statements are false or true. In logic, there are specific rules for determining whether statements like that one, called a conjunction, are true or false. And the rules are mathematical, in that you can plug in a formula and determine whether the statement is true or false based on the rule, which is called a truth function. The same will hold true of disjunctions, which are either-or statements, and conditional statements, which have the form if A then B. Each has a specific math-like rule for determining whether the statement is true or false. This leads to a fourth counterintuitive lesson that logic teaches, which is that it's possible to evaluate an argument's merits without entirely understanding its content. This possibility exists in logic due to the previous point and the fact that we can build upon it a set of rules which allow anyone to deduce an argument's validity without reference to its content. Just as in math, where you can add numbers without worrying about what the numbers reference. 2 plus 3 equals 5, and you don't need to know what you're adding 2 and 3 of to deduce that. You can also infer an argument's validity without worrying about the argument's content or what it's referencing. While this is one of the most difficult points to master in the study of logic, it turns out to be a very powerful tool for the evaluation of everyday arguments. In essence, it gives you a sort of X-ray vision so that you can see through the clutter of an argument to its underlying form. Once you can see the form of an argument, it becomes much easier to determine whether the premises are really providing support to the conclusion or not. A fifth counterintuitive lesson that logic teaches: fallacies of thinking are extremely common in ordinary discourse. With all the power of logical reasoning, it's still quite common for people to be persuaded by faulty arguments. What's worse is that many of these fallacies are easy to recognize with only a little training in the very basic principles of logic. Certainly one of the reasons why fallacies of thinking are so common is because they're so effective. These fallacies in reasoning are effective in part because our brains are wired up to be persuaded in ways that are not always rational, and because without some basic knowledge of logic, it's easy to overlook these fallacies. This is where knowing a little psychology comes in very handy. Logic tends to operate on the assumption that the best arguments are ones that are based on sound principles of reason and not psychological tactics. But the best arguments from a logical standpoint are not always the most persuasive, and the most persuasive arguments are not always based on sound logical principles. This raises an interesting question. Is it possible to construct an argument that's based on sound logical principles and also be psychologically persuasive? In fact, it is. I'll be discussing some interesting insights about influence in a later episode, but it is entirely possible to use both sound logical principles and psychology in a way that's genuine and not manipulative. This is a point that's often overlooked in logic textbooks, where any reference to psychology usually involves its potential to be used as a tool for manipulating people into agreeing with your argument. Logic does not endorse manipulation, but you can be persuasive without being manipulative. What I've come to appreciate in my own study of psychology as it relates to thinking and persuasion is that it might not be possible to be persuasive if you only appeal to sound logical principles. You might get verbal agreement with the points you're making, but you probably won't get action. Getting people to act on your argument requires that you appeal not only to their head, but also their heart. If you enjoyed this episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast and visit me online at kevinjbrown.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode.